Greetings, everyone. My name is William Porter. Welcome to this edition of Storytelling Time. I'm a member of the Every Black Entrepreneurship Network here in the Raleigh, North Carolina area. And I'm also an author. I write inspirational books. I write about the experiences people have that are unusual, extraordinary, and sometimes even miraculous. I've written 3 books to date. The first book was entitled Life in the Spirit. It's a non-fictional work, and it's about the experiences people have had that are unusual and many believe were divinely inspired. My second book is Heaven Can't Wait, which is a fictional novel about relationships. And my third book is entitled Miracles in the Lives of Ordinary People. It, again, like the first book, is a non-fictional work. And it, too, is about people's accounts of their experiences that are unusual and sometimes miraculous, and in many cases believe that they were divinely inspired. So those are the 3 books prior to my latest book that I've written, and I'm really excited about my latest book, by the way, Heaven Can't Wait, the sequel, which is a follow-up of the second book that I wrote, and it's a fictional novel, again, about relationships. Today's podcast is about the time when I had an interview with one of the local leaders here in the Raleigh, North Carolina area. His name is Mike Manning, and it was very inspirational, and the podcast is just another way of illustrating how technology comes into play as far as being able to communicate the success of entrepreneurs doing their business. And that's what it's all about. And you'll get to see some of that interview this week, at least the first part of that interview this week. So let's get on with that interview.
Hello and welcome to Triangle BNI. Today's show is brought to you by Oak City Tech. Oak City Tech gives their clients an edge over their competition with web and logo design that make them stand out. They increase brand awareness and generate leads with SEO and social media presence, and then convert those leads into clients for you with content creation and email marketing. Founded in Raleigh in 2009, Oak City Tech works with businesses, organizations, and brands around the country. So go to oakcitytech.com, see how they can help you. Say hi to Drago, tell them we sent you, and I know they'll be able to help you. Hi, everybody. My name is Mike Manning, and each week we bring you wonderful small business success stories from Triangle BNI. If you are not familiar with BNI, it is Business Networking International, the world's largest networking organization. Our little slice of heaven here in the Triangle, if you're not familiar with North Carolina, it's Raleigh, Durham, and Chapel Hill. We have 30 chapters meeting every week, helping each other grow their business, have 6 core chapters trying to get to full chapter status, and then roughly 600 members each week. We'd love for you to go to trianglebni.com. In the upper right-hand corner, it says find a chapter. Click on that, pull that down, and you can look for any part of the Triangle, any day, any daytime, and see what works out good for you. We'd love to have you come visit. We have wonderful stories each week. You're going to meet neat people like our guest this week, William Porter, who is the first author on the show. William, good to have you here today.
Good being here.
We've had a lot of distinguished people, but none, I think, write as well as you. So we'll look forward to talking to you about all the books you wrote. And we'll have some fun with that. William is in RDO2, Cary Connections. They meet Monday mornings at 8:30 at the Maton Inn in Cary. And we're both back from his meeting this morning. He had Visitors Day, had a good turnout, about 13 visitors, and hopefully a couple of new members will join, and they'll get to know how special your group is.
Well, I look forward to this interview. As a matter of fact, we've talked about it for some time. Mm-hmm. And I'm looking forward to your question. Hopefully, I'll be able to give you some answers.
You'll be just fine. So we are in the last week of July. I think just about a month ago, it was middle of January for 2019. The year seems to have flown by. How has business been? How's your creativity with upcoming books, previous book sales and everything? How's the year been for you?
Well, you speak of the end of July. I just started a podcast last June with the group I belong to, one of the groups I belong to. And one of the efforts that we have that I've introduced on my podcast is the writing of a book. I provide workshops, by the way, to beginning writers and prospective authors. And what I decided to do with this series of podcasts is to offer my listeners an opportunity to write their book. I assume that many of them will be writing their first book. And what I give them on these podcasts, I give them ideas as to how to best do that. So I'm looking forward to that. But to get back to what I was referencing as far as this being the end of July, I have as a goal, or at least I put forward to them as a goal, one of our goals is to write the first or complete the first chapter of the book by the end of July.
Okay.
And so hopefully those of you who are writing out there, those who are writing with us, me as well as other listeners on my podcasting show, will have done that within the next 2 or 3 days. I believe we have a couple of days left in July. So that's one of the things we're doing with my new podcasting.
Where can they
series.
find your podcasts?
My podcast can be found if they were to go to www.entrepreneurship.com. Excuse me, let me correct that. www.entrepreneurship.black. That is the website they could go to get more information about what we're doing.
What kind of first-time writers come to you? Are there all kinds of different backgrounds, stages in life, all that good stuff?
When people come to me and ask me about becoming a writer, many people tell me that they believe it's something hard. When I tell them that I'm a writer or an author, they wonder exactly how they could do that, because many people really would like to become an author. They would like to write their own material, but the problem is that many people, I find, are apprehensive about doing that because they think it's hard. And what I try to do is tell them that it's not really hard, but it does require a lot of work. And so as a result, one of the things I do in addition to being an author is providing workshops for beginning writers and prospective authors. And I give them secrets or pointers, or however you want to put it, things that they could do to enhance their chances of writing a book in particular. And again, we've been doing that since the beginning of June as far as these podcasts are concerned. So I'm really excited about that.
And you and I actually, about a month and a half ago, we sat down and did our one-to-one, and I'd asked you that very question, that I'm very interested in writing a book. And it's like with any industry, we think we know how it goes and we really don't. And you were explaining to me that it's not that difficult to do once you have the content. But I'm just always curious on the timeline, because you were saying that by the end of the month, you want to have your first chapter done. Do you put timelines on yourself when you're writing a book? And how would you recommend for the creativity of all of us to come out?
Well, one of the things that I suggest to people, especially if they haven't written, is to, number one, know what they're going to write about.
Yep.
And I suggest to people that it's best if they write about something that they're familiar with, because if you write about something you're familiar with, then it's much easier to write. And you can do that simply by summarizing a particular topic with a title. And you can make the title simple, but that basically summarizes what you would like to talk about in your book. And then the second thing I tell people is the fact that they need to identify several subjects that they might want to talk about beneath that title. And I indicate to them that later, as they progress in writing their manuscript, these subjects will become the chapters. And basically, I tell them to develop an outline.
Okay.
And that outline might be 5 or maybe 10 subjects. And again, as they develop each of those subjects, they later will become the chapters in their book.
Is it simple for me to assume that you start at the beginning when you're writing a book, or do you start with a story and you realize that's the middle part and let me write the beginning and the end to it? Or how do things start for you when you're writing a book?
Well, personally, I start at the beginning. I have heard that
Yeah.
some writers start at the end. In other words, they begin writing about the conclusion to their work first, and then they work backwards. Well, for me, I haven't gotten quite to that point yet. I usually start at the very beginning. But I do, again, as I said just a moment ago, I have an outline of maybe 5 or 10 or maybe even 15 subjects that I would like to write about. And then I start with that first subject and develop that subject as far as the material within it. And that eventually becomes my first chapter. As a matter of fact, as far as this series that I was telling you about that we're doing, me and many of our listeners, I'm writing right along with them.
Oh,
and
nice.
I'm not sure exactly how many of my listeners are developing their book along with me. I'm hopeful that many of them are. But I indicated initially, we started, for example, our podcast on June the 8th. And by the way, my podcast can be accessed on Saturdays at 9 a.m. Again, www.entrepreneurship.black. Go to that website, you'll be able to access my podcast, which airs every Saturday morning. But at the beginning of the very first episode on the 8th of June, I indicated to my listeners that I'd like to have as a deadline to write the first or complete the first chapter at the end of June. And things came up, as often do when you write. And personally, I didn't come close to finishing my first chapter at the end of June. So I didn't practice what I preached, basically. And so I extended that deadline to July, the end of July. And I have finished the first chapter. As a matter of fact, a couple of weeks ago, I finished writing my first chapter.
Okay.
And actually started writing the second chapter. And I implored my listeners to do the same. And I give them tips as to how to best do that. And so I really feel good about it. As far as a timeline, you need to develop some kind of timeline in order to develop specific subjects or chapters. And the timeline that I decided upon was progress successive months, beginning with June, which didn't work out.
Mhm.
And so I indicated to my listeners that July should definitely be the month where they finished writing the first chapter. So hopefully, again, I hope they did. I certainly did.
Do you find when you've written books and other authors you've talked to that you'll have a creative window and you just keep writing and writing and writing, and then some days or weeks just like nothing's coming to me?
It really depends on some of the other things that I'm doing. For example, I'm writing as we speak the manuscript actually to my 6th book. I think I mentioned to you that I've written 3 books already. As a matter of fact, let me share with you the 3 books that I've written already.
Okay.
Life in the Spirit was published in August of 2015. It's my first book.
Yep. Just hold that to the camera. There they go. And we're going to talk about each one of these as we go. Yep. So
this was my first book, nonfiction about the experiences people have had that are unusual, extraordinary, and in some cases miraculous. And then the second book that I wrote was published in July. Get this straight, July of 2017. This is a fictional novel about relationships. And by the way, I have a sequel coming out in about a month to this particular novel. And then the third book that I wrote is Miracles in the Lives of Ordinary People. It's another non-fictional account of experiences that people have had that are unusual, extraordinary, and sometimes miraculous. So, but I've finished my fourth manuscript. As a matter of fact, my daughter just finished reviewing my fourth manuscript about a couple of weeks ago. That won't be published until springtime 2020, maybe early summer 2020. And that will be my fifth book. And then my sixth book, again, I'm writing on right now with my listeners as we progress with these podcasts.
Is your daughter a hard grader on your book?
She
come
really
back
is.
With red marks a lot?
She's very, she's not lenient, I'll put it that way. Even though I'm her father, she's very strict as far as her.
But that helps you though, right?
It helps it helps a lot. And not only my daughter, but when she finishes, I go over the manuscript again, and then I send the manuscript to my editor that I'm working with the publisher that I have. Okay. So it's a process, and that's the thing about being a writer. As I mentioned to my listeners each week, it is work. It's not difficult,
right?
But it requires work. And I often talk about the 3 P's of success: purpose, product, and process. Well, the process part is the work part of it. Maybe we'll get to the first 2 after a bit.
Okay, all right. We are here with William Porter. He's an author in RDO2, Carry Connections. They meet Mondays at 8:30 a.m. at the Maiden Inn. Today's show is brought to you by Oak City Tech, where they will help you reach your goals with proven technologies for increasing traffic, leads, and sales to help you grow your business. Please go to oakcitytech.com and check them out. Each week at B&I meetings, there's a featured speaker, and depending on the size of the group, it's either 5 minutes or 10 minutes. And each week, the featured speaker is introduced with the bio sheet, William. So that's how we do it here. So we're going to give you a chance to talk more about, let people get to know you a little bit more. Okay. William Porter, an author, is in RDO2, Carry Connections. Years in the business? How many?
I've been an author now for 5 years.
Right. In previous jobs, so we'll get to some of the work and stuff. We find our best stories on this show come from high school. And that you say, okay, or growing up in Eastern North Carolina, I know you're working way before high school. So give us that one good story that we will enjoy that you had growing up, whether it lasted a long time or a short period of time, but a memorable one that you've had.
Well, as you suggest, I've had several stories, and but I'll mention maybe 2 or 3. Coming up, as I may have suggested earlier, indicated that I'll be turning 70 very shortly, and my first recollection of a major event in my life was Hurricane Hazel here in Eastern North Carolina, and if you're old enough, you may remember that as well. But we had one of the first television sets in the community, and I remember my cousins, about 7 or 8 of them, coming to our house from about 4 blocks down the road to look at television. They did that very often, but on that particular day or weekend, I forget the time of that hurricane, but they came to our house to ride the hurricane out, and I remember looking outside, seeing the roofs being blown off of buildings. And we had a tree, a pecan tree in the backyard about maybe 10 feet from our house. And that hurricane blew the pecan tree over. Oh. And at that time in 1954, of course, I was about 4 or 5 years old. And I remember the roots of the tree after it had been blown over were taller than I was at the time.
Wow.
And it took my father 3 or 4 weeks, maybe even longer, to get rid of that pecan tree. And so we didn't have that tree any longer. We had another, as a matter of fact, we had a number of fruit trees in our backyard, plum trees, cherry trees, as well as trees. But that was a huge tree. But the point is that I write inspirational books. And that was an unusual and even miraculous situation because of the direction in which the tree fell. It fell away from our house onto the property of our neighbor next door. The point is that if the tree had fallen or had been blown toward our house being a wood structure, it would have devastated our house, and we would have been without a home at that particular time. So that was a miraculous event. And there are other events that happened growing up that I remember. My sister passed in 1959. I was actually in the same room as she lay dying on her bed. I was on a couch with my head covered, and the doctors were there, and they were trying to console my mother, which was kind of difficult to do. If you can imagine, I believe she had meningitis, if I remember correctly, and my head was under the covers. She was 2 years younger than I was at the time. I think I was 10, she was 8, and we used to go to school together. I think I was in the second grade, she was in the first grade, and so we were close. Her name was Mary Ann, and I heard the whole thing as to how, or the fact that she was in fact dying, and my mother ran out of the house screaming up and down the street that she was gone, and I actually shed a tear or two under the covers, and so I remember that back in 1959. In 1962, our house burned to the ground. My mother was cooking some spaghetti on, I think it was a Tuesday night. Believe it or not, I remember the day way back.
Funny what we remember it.
But at any rate, she was cooking some spaghetti. Of course, something that she actually should not have been doing, cooking some spaghetti on a space heater, I believe it was, or an oil heater with a wick coming up and the actual flames coming out of the oil heater. Anyway, she had that pot of spaghetti on that heater. But anyway, to make a long story short, it was near a window, and somehow the flames or the steam rose, and there were flames that came up from the heater, and it hit the curtains, the flames, and of course the flames continued up the curtain and over the ceiling, and our father was fanatical trying to get us out of the house, and we finally got out of the house, and we were standing in front of our house now burning to the ground. And my father's kind of interesting. After it was all over, he communicated to my mother. He didn't say a whole lot to me. Keep in mind, I was very young at the time. Back in those days, parents don't say a great deal to their kids, or didn't. But at any rate, he mentioned to her, I remember him telling her that he heard from some trees in the back of our house, maybe some of those plum trees, cherry trees that I talked about a minute ago, that he heard a voice saying that everything's going to be all right. Now, this was in the midst of I think it was after the aftermath of the house burning down. So he heard voices, or a voice, telling him that. So I always remember that. And now, with the experience that I have, I can understand how our Creator tells us things, a lot of things that sometimes we don't pay attention to. And I believe that the Creator told him that to mainly, I guess, console him at that particular time.
Did everybody get out okay?
We got out. It was just me and my parents. And so, again, it was another period of time when my mother cried, and she happened to go next door. And the next year, we went to my aunt's house, which was about a mile away, and we lived there for a year before returning to the new house on that spot. My father had a new house built on that very spot. Right. So anyway,
the next part of the bio sheet actually talks about family. So let's break this into two parts. Let's talk about your family with your wife, who's having a birthday. She is younger than you, so I know you brag about that, right? And she does too. She keep reminding you that she's the younger one in the house.
She does. She does. But yeah, she celebrated her 60th birthday about 3 weeks ago, earlier in July.
Mm-hmm.
And we had a big gathering at our house, and it was a grand event. And as I may have mentioned earlier, we're going to have another event in a couple of months in October, celebrating my 70th birthday.
Now, I always ask people on the show that are married, how did you and your wife meet? And do you both tell the story the same way?
Pretty much. And it's kind of interesting how we met. I was initially married for 34 years. As a matter of fact, my wife passed in 2010, and that was a traumatic experience, of course. But it's kind of interesting how all of that happened. And by the way, the story of her passing is in this book, and the title, that is
Life in the Spirit.
Life in the Spirit.
Okay.
And the story is there about how that situation materialized. But anyway, to make a long story short, I wasn't interested necessarily in remarrying at that point. But the way things turned out, I met a wonderful lady at a festival here in Raleigh, and I was actually looking for some additional employment, or more employment. I had retired earlier, about a year earlier, from teaching. And we might get into that a little bit
it's on my
later.
list. Yep.
But anyway, I had retired, and I was looking for some part-time work in my retirement. And so I just happened to be in Raleigh and went to this festival in September of 2010, about 2.5 months after my wife of 34 years had passed. And so I met her, and I really wanted to get a job at where she worked, and I saw that she was under a tent that indicated that they were promoting Wake Technical Institute, or Wake Technical College here in Raleigh. And so I wanted to get a job, and I asked her about giving me some contacts at the school to get me a job at Wake Tech. And so it was about 2 or 3 weeks before I heard from her again after we made that initial conversation. And I wanted to at least call her back to thank her for giving me the number to the administration at Wake Tech so I could inquire about the possibility of getting a job there. And so, but I didn't hear from her in a couple of weeks. And again, to make a long story short, eventually I did call her and made contact with her again. I guess we hit it off, so to speak. And I guess the rest is history, as they say.
Right. And you have a daughter who is your editor?
I have a daughter, my younger daughter, as my unofficial editor.
Right.
I have an older daughter. She doesn't do the editing kind of work, but she does a lot of other things that really help me as far as promoting the book. Pretty soon, I mentioned that I'll have a sequel to the fictional novel that I've written. Heaven Can't Wait is the name of it, if I didn't mention the name. And again, it's about relationships, and it's very exciting because relationships are interesting, how people get into and out of relationships, and the sequel continues that. And so my older daughter helps me a great deal as far as promoting that through book signings and that kind of thing. So I look forward to that.
Also on the sheet that we ask questions for the featured speaker is what is your burning desire?
Well, it's kind of interesting that initially when I wrote my first book, Life in the Spirit, my burning desire was that everyone who has an interest in reading inspirational material would in fact somehow get a copy of Life in the Spirit, because I realized that many people love to read, but people like to read different kinds of material. And not everyone would necessarily like reading, quote unquote, inspirational material. And what I mean by inspirational, again, experiences I've written about people having these unusual, extraordinary events, sometimes miraculous events. And it's very compelling. And I've put these events in this first book, Life in the Spirit, As a matter of fact, the very first chapter is about my daughter, my older daughter, who gave out of gas on 440.
You told me that. I was going to ask you about this, yes.
She came home one day and said, Dad, I'm out of gas. I gave out the gas today. That wasn't a good feeling when your daughter comes in and tells you that she gave out of gas. In other words, it kind of lets you know that she was on the road stranded for a while. But anyway, she did tell us that she was able to guide the vehicle, even though it was totally out of gas, for about 1.5 miles off of the Beltline, the interstate here in Raleigh, North Carolina, to a nearby gas station.
On to Glenwood, right by the hotel at the BP station, right?
Yep. The car glided exactly where it needed to be for her to get the gas that she needed. And so she declared that God helped her with that particular situation. So that was the first chapter.
Okay.
And then I had 14 other chapters.
Yeah.
By the way, another chapter, actually it's chapter 14. My brother was in town from Florida, and we were at Triangle Town Center here in Raleigh. And he had something to get. We live in Garner. And so after he got whatever he needed to get from Triangle Town Center, we started to my house. He was staying with me that particular weekend. And I came down this particular road. You may be familiar with the Garner Road going from Raleigh into Garner. And we were getting ready to cross a railroad crossing just before going to White Oak. And just as I was approaching the railroad crossing, we heard a noise from the left side of the vehicle where there were a lot of trees and brush. You really couldn't see very clearly. And what happened was that there was a freight train coming from the left, and we were able to, at least I was able to stop the vehicle just before going across the railroad tracks. And I had to hold my right foot on the brake pedal for at least 2 or 3 minutes so the car would not move forward into the freight train. And so, of course, eventually the freight train passed. And if you're familiar with freight trains, they take forever to pass. And it took that amount of time being on pins and needles with my right foot on the brake pedal. And so that story was story 14.
Okay.
So those are the kinds of stories that you'll read about in my first book, Life in the Spirit. Well, thank you for being with us on the podcast today. And in closing, keep in mind that whatever you're going through, whether it's good or bad, there's always more good things coming your way. And also keep in mind, this podcast today will be continued, part 2, on the next time. So have a good day and a good week, and we'll see you then.